over the last year and a half, the COVID-19 pandemic has made visible many long ignored realities of the Indian economy. Its fragility, its regional and spatial concentration, and deep structural inequality. But it has also highlighted areas of resilience and strength. In our effort to reframe our debates about the Indian economy going forward, the Center for Policy Research is launching a new series that focuses on the economy and particularly focuses on the structure and dynamics of the rural economy. Addressing India's structural inequalities and making markets genuinely competitive requires an integrated framework that overcomes many of the binaries that have long defined the way in which we've thought about the economy. So rural versus urban, welfare versus growth, agriculture versus the non-agricultural economy, and most importantly, perhaps the informal versus the formal. And so over the next few months, scholars from across CPR will offer insights into these different aspects of the rural economy and most importantly into their critical interlinkages. And this is part of an effort that we hope will contribute to building a new imagination for the Indian economy for its economic recovery and growth a post-COVID India. So the first note that we've put together and the first piece of analysis actually focuses on some of the seasonal and structural dynamics that determined agricultural performance. And this has actually been something that has stood out over the last year. And so Harish, would you like to come in and share some of the context as well as the historical context within which we've seen this performance over the last year?
Yeah, I think this calamity has been very different from past natural calamities. Whenever there have been natural calamities in the past, it has always been mainly due to one of the three F's, either food, fuel, or foreign exchange. Okay, this time there's been no shortage of food, there's been no shortage of fuel. I mean, it's not as though international fuel prices, there's been no oil shock, right? And India has had no foreign exchange shortage either. Actually, our forex reserves went up by about 100 billion in the last 1 year. So this has been a calamity without the usual three F's. Okay, and there has been no, I mean, especially F. I think our focus is on food. Right. This time we have had no hoarding of edible oils, sugar, grains, dal, nothing of this kind. We have had only hoarding of remdesivir, right? Oxygen cylinders, and those kind of things. So this has been a very unusual calamity by historical standards, and where agriculture did well, India itself has recorded since independence. I mean, this is recorded. We don't know much about the pre-independence, this thing. Post-independence, there were about 4 recessions, 4 economic contractions in 1965-66, in 1972-73, prior to that in 1957-58, and the last one was in 1979-80. In each of these 4 years were drought years. And where agriculture degrowth was higher than general degrowth. But 2020-21 was an unusual year where the economy contracted by a record 7.3%. Okay, but agriculture grew by 3.6%, which has never happened. So I think whenever history is written, this will go down as a very unusual year. So the question to ask is, how did this happen? I will say there were 2 sides. One was just good luck, which had to do with the good monsoons. Farmers never waste a good monsoon. When like if it rains well, if the soil moisture is good, they will sow at come what may, at any cost. Just like if the crop is good, they will reap at any cost, come what may. Okay, so last year you had good monsoon. When the monsoon was good, farmers went ahead with sowing. Okay, so there was a shortage of labor, etc. They basically they used their own family labor. They got since there were many migrants who had returned from urban centers, they used the migrant labor. Okay, so contrary to all expectations, including of Mekhla and I, the farmers managed to harvest the entire crop, right? Every like in the case of sugarcane, every last stick of sugarcane was harvested and delivered to the mill. Okay, the transplanting of paddy, which we never thought would happen, because a plantation is very labor intensive. But even I mean, every acre which could be transplanted with paddy got transplanted. The nurseries were prepared on time, and sowing also happened. So I think in that way, the monsoon was the main driver, and farmers generally, they respond very well to monsoon, and farmers are not prone to, they don't procrastinate like us, they don't look at the past, they're not weighed down too much by the burden of the past. They look, the moment there is good rains, they are very happy and they go ahead with planting. I think that is the number one reason why I think agriculture grew. And the second, I would say, is being good policy. Okay, when I say good policy, what I mean is that the government allowed agricultural activities to continue unhindered. So there were no lockdown restrictions. Okay, so there were no restrictions on movement of farm labor, movement of harvesting combines. Right, and same thing, so the fertilizer factories ran, fertilizer sales continued, and most important, the mandis were allowed to function, okay, and plus government procurement happened. So I would say these two factors, because of no lockdown restrictions, because of continued procurement, and the fact that there was a good monsoon, I think these were the three factors which led to agriculture being quite good. I mean, I would say that 2020-21 was one of the best years for Indian agriculture after 2013-14. When prices also were good, especially in the second half. I think I think Mekhala will be able to elaborate on some of the crops which didn't do very well. Yeah.
And I think what you've said is what we've come to, that you have a good monsoon. You had policy that enabled agriculture. And I think if we remember back to the early lockdown, there was a challenge in the sense that as soon as it happened, all of us who follow agriculture knew that it was harvesting season and it's the main marketing season, and agriculture had to wait for the addendum to rectify it. But the rectification came quickly. And I think the orders came quickly to say that agricultural activity should proceed. I think many of us observed that this wasn't easy for farmers. So I think when you're saying that farmers don't waste a good monsoon, that they make the most of it, I think you're also pointing out an inherent versatility, dynamism, movement, that often comes from constraints and requirement, right? Not because they're necessarily always supported, but because they're adaptive. And I know that from many of our conversations with farmers in the fields that they struggled, as did mandis and traders, and there were disruptions, particularly in the supply of certain kinds of materials. But what you really saw was an inherent resilience, an adaptability, and ability to quickly make things happen. As you said, with labor also, people managed to make the harvest, and both the sowing and harvest happen. So I think that is one very critical feature that really came through. But I think the second thing you mentioned, which was procurement. The fact is that the government did do record levels of procurement of wheat and paddy and a number of other crops as well, that we saw where dairy cooperatives were strong. There was excess milk procurement that was also made possible, that cooperatives were able to come in. And I think here it's just important that while the aggregate picture of procurement is very robust, to pay attention to two very important factors. First, that procurement in India has always been spatially concentrated in certain states. But as many have pointed out over the last 15 years, that has expanded considerably, including states that have really taken up decentralized procurement. Madhya Pradesh for wheat, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Andhra, Telangana for paddy. And so it wasn't only Punjab and Haryana who benefited. There were a number of other states who over the years have built their capacity for decentralized procurement. I think the fact that pre-existing institutions were able to mobilize and galvanize show the importance of these kinds of investments over many years, and the importance of these investments during a crisis. So states which did not have well-developed procurement systems, whether in the traditional system or more recently were not able to benefit as much as other states from government procurement. And so states which did not have good cooperatives, for example, were not able to. So you saw much more disruption. Secondly, those commodities which have not really benefited from systemic investments, right, by government and other institutions. So horticulture, for example, experienced a lot more disruption. Floriculture really had a very, very bad time because demand both from sites like whether it's religious sites, whether it's weddings, routine use, all of that closed down. So they had a very, very tough time. And certain
Poultry also, yeah.
and certain
Poultry also.
major
Poultry.
like poultry, exactly, poultry, and therefore maize, started seeing a hit. And because they are not used to having procurement mechanisms or state support, were not able to be supported. And prices didn't rise like it did for other commodities, for some of these others. So if you didn't have institutional mechanisms, if they were not part already of the policy and institutional complex that supports agriculture, those regions and those commodities really didn't do well and had a much harder time. So I think that's one important lesson to take from this. Similarly, like with agriculture, procurement, we also saw this with NREGA. Public distribution, procurement, MGNREGA, these are often accused of being, large programs that absorb a lot of fiscal resources, but they were the ones that were really lifelines this year. And I think that's so important to keep in mind, that they did their work and they really were an important source of support. And even PM Kisan, for example, if that had not been already in place, farmers had not been identified, the systems hadn't been put in place, you could see that reaching aid to farmers was easier and more viable than reaching aid to migrant workers, where the state says the data didn't exist, the databases didn't exist. So these prior investments really did prove to be extremely important. But as we said, there is regional diversity in terms of the states that managed to benefit from this, and commodity complexes. So that's the second. I think these are very important lessons for us to learn. But looking ahead, I think there are some structural factors that we need to kind of grapple with, as well as seasonal factors. So looking ahead, again, we have to think about what is going to be the progression of the pandemic this year. Second, and therefore lockdowns, regional and otherwise. Second is the question of the monsoon this year, and the third is prices. But I think even beyond that, there are some structural factors that really help us think about what might be the challenges for diversification and real agricultural growth. I think, even in our piece, we put it in quotes to say savior. This happens because the rest of the economy did so poorly. Agriculture had some good factors, and we have seen some change, but this is also cyclical. I remember during the 2008 financial crisis, again, we talked about how rural demand propped up the economy. Again, during COVID, we've talked about this. But we mustn't forget the structural factors and the interlinkages that really drive agriculture, and the fact that so many farmers do experience lowering of incomes and agricultural distress. So, Harish, just thinking forward about both the seasonal dynamics that may play out this coming year and some of the deeper structural dynamics that we will have to look into as we try and understand the future of Indian agriculture.
Okay, let us first look at the current year. Okay, 2020-21, no doubt agriculture did relatively well to the rest of the economy. This year, first thing, everything depends on the monsoon, how the monsoon is. The Met department is saying it's going to be a very good monsoon. I think they're talking of about only 26% probability of a below normal or deficient monsoon. But I'm not fully. I think it's better to hold our horses there. May you had about 74% surplus rainfall, right? And this month so far it has been something like about 19% surplus. But we really need to look, how the monsoon pans out in the remaining in the coming weeks, etc. Whether there will be dry spells. Right now, yes, the moisture level is good, soil moisture is good. I mean, farmers probably are going to go for a lot of sowing. Okay, and I expect a lot of area to increase this time under cotton, under soybean. under groundnut, because mainly because the prices are very good. International prices have been very good in the case of edible oil. So you can expect a lot of soybean area to go up, a lot of groundnut area to go up, even cotton also. I think basically the world needs cotton, right? Because the world is unlocking. So therefore it needs fiber. Okay, so and cotton prices always rise when crude oil, petroleum prices rise, because it's basically competing with synthetic fiber. So I think cotton, soybean, and groundnut, we are going to see a lot of increase in the area this time. But again, what will happen after the farmer has sown, and then during the vegetative state of the crop, suddenly there is a dry spell. What are we going to do? So we need to look at how the monsoon is. Last year it was a perfect monsoon. Last year and 2019. Third year in succession, I'll be very happy. 3 times lucky would be, it'll be real, whatever, manna from heaven. Okay, so that is one thing. The second is, of course, COVID. Okay, last year there was no COVID. Whenever I used to go to Bihar or anywhere, the people there used to ask us, what is COVID? And there was a certain machismo, right? They were saying, COVID will come, we'll smash them. Okay, but this time, believe me, there is a lot of worry, there is a lot of fear, there is a lot of uncertainty. So I don't think you can expect farmers, even if the income is good, they're not going to buy a new tractor, they're not going to buy gold. I don't think consumer durables, or repair of houses. Typically, when there is a good harvest, when farmers have bulk income, they typically, they will, whether marriages, right, rebuilding one's own home, buying consumer durables, buying tractor. I think these will be a little, they will be a lot of precautionary savings, just like all of us, right? We know that insurance didn't work this time in COVID, right? So as long as this virus, the uncertainty due to the virus, because the virus is now real, virus is a fact of life. In any village, maybe 100 people, maybe 15 people would have died. So when you see this fear, automatically there will be more tendency for more precautionary kind of savings. So I think that even in rural areas, you are going to see more precautionary savings. So it's not as though even assuming the monsoon is good, the crop is bumper, the prices are good, farm incomes are good, we don't know whether that money will be spent like the way it was. Last year the farmers even spent on agitation, right? There was a lot of this thing. They went to the Kumbh Mela, right? So there was incomes, but probably those incomes may not be spent this year like it was spent last year. That is the near term thing. Yeah.
And he's just picking up on the question of incomes. Agriculture, farmers then, spur rural demand by spending surplus income, but also, they depend on incomes growing steadily in the economy to really generate demand for agricultural produce, a whole variety of agricultural produce, and particularly as you think about the driving of diversification through demand, it's extremely important. One, of course, diversification can be invested in and driven by government support, right? Different kinds of incentives, greater procurement of a wider basket of commodities, putting those commodities into our, whether it's midday meal schemes or ICDS. This is something people have been talking about. But there's also the drivers of diversification that come from a healthy economy, from people spending more on diverse and better kinds of food, moving away from cereal centricity. And that is something that is been not seen for several years. It's not just the pandemic per se, but we've been seeing that there is a challenge there, in terms of a steadily rising income and consumption basket, which the pandemic was just hit, because we'll see in some of the future work that we do on rural wages, on employment, and on expenditure. So I think that's the other piece, the structural conditions that we need to address.
Yeah, see, the other thing which we are not understanding is, an average farm household it depends also on non-farm incomes. It's not as though a farm household today gets its entire income from just farming. There will always be somebody who will be working in the city, who will be working not on the farm. He or she may be in the army, maybe a nurse, maybe a security guard, maybe working outside, maybe a software engineer. So
laborers. Because many
laborers, yes,
laborers.
precisely. So many of them are engaged in non-agricultural work. So it's not as though your rural is not entirely agriculture. Okay, so and when we are saying that rural is not entirely agriculture, I'm saying that even in a farming household, the non-farm incomes are very significant. So I think when the rest of the economy is not growing, it affects farm incomes also. Apart from the fact what Mikla is saying, when incomes generally are poor, there would be less demand for things like chicken, milk, vegetables, right? I mean, people will tend to go back to a calorie-rich meal, which is basically more of rice, more of sugar, things which are much cheaper. So they will go less for milk, for nutritious this thing, and whereas I think it is actually the animal agriculture and horticulture which grew a lot. In maybe say after 2000, 2000 to 2015, a lot of agriculture growth came actually from horticulture and animal agriculture, and those in turn grew on the back of rising incomes, rising incomes generally, basically a poor becoming lower middle class, a very poor becoming poor, So they were general rising incomes, from the bottom, and that was the one which was actually driving demand for chicken and meat and fish and milk and those kind of things, from both sides. So the general economy has to do well, the general economy has to do well for demand, demand for farm produce. General economy has to do to create diversification options for farmers, that is non-farm within farm, because everybody, all farming family members cannot be engaged in agriculture, and agriculture cannot support them. So I don't think rural can play savior just on the back of agriculture, in turn depending on a good monsoon, in turn depending on prices. I think that's very, somehow last year it somehow clicked, so which is what I said from the beginning, it had to do with a bit of luck, yeah.
So I think just finally to conclude, as we look forward, we have to think about agriculture again as a very dynamic sector. It has shown its abilities to absorb shock and also make the most of, good and opportune conditions. But I think going forward, we have to engage much more with these dynamics of production and consumption, and the dynamics of diversification both on and off farm, and agriculture both as a sector that doesn't just absorb people and employment, but also drives certain kinds of positive relationships as a multiplier. And this is something actually our economic policy has failed to do over the years. It has really reduced agriculture to a residual sector, to a welfare sector. And I think reinvesting in its dynamism is going to be critical. And so for us, these are going to be areas that we really dig deeper into over the next few months. And we look forward to sharing more of that, both research and analysis as we develop it.